Snow drifted in lazy spirals, the kind that blurred the world into silence and made the station seem less a building than a shadow holding its breath against the storm. A lantern burned above the platform, its flame bent sideways by the wind. The crowd huddled close, boots stamping, scarves pulled high, eyes cast toward the tracks. No one looked at the man waiting at the far end. Not directly. They looked only long enough to whisper. Dakota Greyhawk sat in a battered wheelchair, a buffalo fur coat thrown across his broad frame, his chest bare beneath as if no garment dared disguise his shame. Snow gathered in his long black hair, settling in the hollows of his scars. He sat still, hands gripping the wooden rims of his wheels, dark eyes lowered to the planks. A giant once, he looked diminished only because the world had decided so. The children hiding behind their mothers saw a monster. The ranchers smirking from the corner saw a cripple. The sheriff chewing tobacco on the rail saw trouble best kept at a distance. The train screamed its arrival, iron shrieking against iron, steam clouding the platform in a hissing fog. From it descended a woman in a new bonnet, cheeks powdered pink, gloves pristine white against the dark wool of her coat. Mrs. Martha Louder's gossip had spread for weeks that she was the one. His mail-order bride, fresh from back east, promised to the Apache giant with the scarred face, and the fortune rumored in whispers. She swept through the mist with a kind of hurried grace, eyes darting over the crowd until they landed on him. The crowd held its breath. Even the children hushed. Her smile froze. For a moment, confusion. Then her gaze dropped to the wheels. To the way his legs lay still, heavy as stone. The color drained from her face. "You," she said, voice pitched high, breaking the hush. "You didn't say you were this." Dakota tried to lift his chin. Words stirred in his throat but died there, strangled by the weight of eyes pressing against him. He had thought himself braced for this moment, had rehearsed it in silence. Her hand upon his, her acceptance, the promise of a beginning. But now the cold gnawed deeper. The woman's cheeks burned. "I won't," she snapped. "I won't be bound to a cripple." Gasps rippled. Martha Louder's tongue clucked like a struck kettle drum. Silas Boone, leaning against a post with whiskey on his breath, barked laughter that carried over the storm. Sheriff Amos spat into the snow and muttered, "Knew this turned sour." Dakota bowed his head, not in reverence but in retreat. He willed his hands to release the wheels, yet they clutched tighter, as though the wood alone kept him upright in the storm of their judgment. The woman turned sharply. Her skirts swished like a whip. She strode down the platform, heels striking wood with the staccato of rejection, and vanished into the train before steam swallowed her whole. For a long while no one spoke. Then the murmurs began again, louder, freer now that cruelty had been made public. "Fool's errand. Poor girl spared. Serves him right." Dakota remained still. Snow gathered on his coat, his shoulders, his lashes until he looked carved from stone. His breath rose in a steady plume, the only proof that he had not been claimed entirely by the winter. Children darted closer, emboldened by their mother's whispers. A boy bent, scooped snow, packed it hard, and hurled it at the wheel. The wet slap echoed in the hush. Laughter followed. Another ball struck his chest, bursting across the fur. Dakota closed his eyes. If he reached out, one sweep of his arm could scatter them, but to move was to prove he cared. He chose stillness, though the sting was sharp. Elsie Bell McGraw watched from the far end of the platform. She was small, slight, wrapped in a threadbare shawl that did little against the storm. Her shoes were soaked through, her cheeks raw, her hair damp with melted flakes. She had come not for spectacle but for work, a day's labor promised in the kitchens if she could endure the weather. Yet her eyes fixed on him, the way the snow clung to his stillness, the way mockery circled him like wolves around a wounded bull. Something inside her recognized the shape of that loneliness, for she had tasted its flavor. The sting of being unwanted, of being too poor, too young, too dispensable. Her heart trembled as if it remembered a wound it could not name. Sheriff Amos lifted his voice. "Best roll on back, Greyhawk. Ain't nothin' here for you now." Dakota turned the wheels, slow, deliberate. The wood creaked. His muscles flexed like roots dragging stone. The crowd parted, not out of courtesy but fear, as if his touch might soil them. Snow hissed under his wheels, leaving twin tracks that marked him like scars upon the platform. The train screamed again, then lurched into motion, carrying away the woman who had been promised to him. Its smoke bled into the gray sky until it was one with the storm. Dakota reached the end of the platform and paused, as if unsure whether to wheel into the drifts or let the storm cover him whole. His breath caught once, like a man swallowing fire, but his face remained a mask. Behind him, Silas Boone's voice rose once more, sharp with scorn. "Should have stayed with your kind, Greyhawk. Ain't no woman here wants a broken man." Laughter followed. Bitter, heavy, cruel. Elsie flinched. The cruelty grated against her chest. She wanted to speak, to hush them, but words caught like ice. Instead she tightened her shawl and stepped into the shadows, watching as Dakota disappeared down the slope. The platform emptied, townsfolk trailing gossip like smoke from their mouths. Soon only the lantern remained, flame bending in the storm, light stretched thin against the endless dark. Elsie lingered, staring at the twin tracks carved by his wheels, glowing faintly beneath the snow. The storm sought to erase them, but for now they remained, two lines running into the whiteness. She wrapped her arms around herself and felt the weight of a decision forming, an ache that might yet change the course of both their lives. The wind carried a whisper across the platform, whether born of storm or soul she could not say. It curled in her chest, quiet but insistent, a vow not yet spoken. And though she did not move, her eyes followed the fading tracks with a tenderness that no one else in that town dared grant him. The storm thickened, swallowing the last shape of his figure. Still Elsie stared, breath trembling, as if waiting for the moment she might step forward and chase the path the world had cast aside. And in that hush, beneath the weight of snow and silence, the story of their lives tilted toward a beginning. Snow thickened into veils as night pressed closer, and the station's lantern burned alone against the storm. Elsie Bell McGraw lingered long after the others had gone, her breath pluming in the cold, her eyes tracing the fading wheel marks that led away from the platform. She had watched his humiliation, the woman's recoil, the laughter, the sharp words that cut like blades, and something inside her refused to let it rest. She pulled her shawl tighter, though the wind pierced straight through it, and stepped down into the snow. The storm bit at her cheeks, yet she pressed forward, following the grooves where his chair had dragged across the whiteness. Each mark seemed etched not only into snow but into her chest, as though her own breath had carved them. She quickened her pace, her shoes soaking, her heart urging her on. She told herself it was pity, but deeper still it was recognition, the unspoken kinship of two souls the world had scorned. She found him at the edge of town, where the lamplight thinned and the prairie opened wide and merciless. Dakota sat still in his chair, the storm piling snow upon his shoulders. He had not moved for minutes, perhaps hours, save for the slow rise of his breath. He looked like a statue abandoned in the drift, a giant cast down by some cruel fate. Elsie's steps faltered. Her voice trembled before it left her throat, a fragile thread against the wind. "You shouldn't sit here alone." Dakota's head turned, slow as if carved from stone. His dark eyes glistened, though no flame warmed them. "Better alone," he said, voice low, each word bearing weight. She hesitated, fingers knotting in the fringe of her shawl. The urge to flee pricked at her, but something stronger rooted her. She stepped closer until the storm's hush wrapped them both. His sighs overwhelmed her even seated, his chest broad, his arms heavy with strength that mocked his stillness. Yet it was not his strength she saw, it was the quiet ache beneath it, the silence of a man left outside his own life. Elsie drew a breath, her words quivering but firm. "You're coming with me." For an instant his expression did not change. Then his eyes narrowed, as if testing whether she spoke from cruelty or madness. "With you?" The words held disbelief sharp as glass. "Yes." Her chin lifted, though the storm stung her eyes. "I've a small cabin. A fire. Food enough for two if you'll share it." He turned his face away, toward the darkness of the prairie. "I have no need of pity." Her heart stung at the word, for she knew its taste too well. "It isn't pity," she said softly. "It's company. And I won't let the snow bury you here." The wind howled then, filling the silence between them, carrying with it the distant echo of laughter from the town. Laughter still aimed at him, though the voices were long gone. His jaw tightened. For a moment she thought he would wheel himself away into the storm, choosing solitude over the risk of kindness. But his hands only pressed harder to the rims of the chair, leaving him motionless. She stepped behind him without asking, her hands settling on the wooden grips. They were cold, rough against her palms, yet she held fast. He did not resist, and so she pushed. The wheels turned with a groan, carving new tracks into the snow. The town had not yet shuttered itself entirely. Lamps glowed in windows, and behind frosted panes curious eyes widened. Elsie felt the weight of them as she guided him through the streets, the whispers rising again, sharp and merciless. Desperate girl. Foolish girl. Trading her youth for a broken man. She kept her gaze forward, each push a defiance against their scorn. Takota's face remained unreadable, but she saw his shoulders tense, his body drawing inward as if to shield itself from invisible arrows. She wanted to speak, to scatter the judgment with words, yet she knew words were fragile things. Instead, she steadied her pace, letting the rhythm of the wheels through snow become the answer. At last they reached her cabin, a small shack crouched against the storm at the edge of the woods. Its roof sagged, its door leaned, but smoke curled faintly from the chimney, and the glow of fire seeped through the cracks. Elsie pushed him across the threshold, and the world shifted. Snow yielding to warmth, silence giving way to the crackle of flame. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and old pine. A table stood crooked against the wall, 2 chairs beside it, one leg mended by twine. A narrow bed lay tucked in the corner, covered by quilts worn but clean. Elsie hurried to the hearth, stirring the fire until sparks leapt. Then she turned, hands still trembling, and set about placing food before him. A tin cup of broth, a hunk of bread. Takota stared at it but did not reach. His voice was quiet, thick with unease. "I cannot pay." Elsie shook her head, pulling her shawl close. "I didn't ask for coin." His eyes rose to her then, sharp and searching. "Then why?" Her lips parted, but no simple answer came. She thought of nights spent alone, of whispers in town that she was too poor for marriage, too young for respect. She thought of how easily the world discarded what it could not use. At last she said, "Because no one should be left to freeze." For the first time his gaze softened, though only a flicker. He lifted the bread slowly, as if testing whether he had the right. He ate in silence, each bite heavy with the weight of surrender. Elsie busied herself with tending the fire, her heart pounding with every crack of wood. When the silence grew too heavy, she spoke again, her voice gentler. "You're strong still. Stronger than most." He gave a low laugh, bitter as ash. "Strength means nothing when the legs are gone. They see only the chair." She turned, kneeling by the firelight so its glow touched her face. "I don't." The words hung between them, fragile, daring. His breath caught once, chest rising and falling like a tide meeting resistance. He did not answer, but his eyes did not turn away. The storm raged against the cabin walls, rattling shutters and piling snow higher. Within, the fire spread its glow, drawing shadows close but leaving their faces bright. Elsie pulled a blanket and draped it gently across his lap. He did not move to stop her. Outside, the wind carried with it the murmurs of the town, faint but unyielding. Gossip was a shadow that did not rest, circling, waiting to sink teeth. Yet here in the small cabin, for the first time that night, silence felt like safety. Elsie sat across from him, her hands folded tight, her eyes steady though her heart raced. He ate slowly, each motion deliberate, as though testing the boundary between shame and acceptance. When at last his hands stilled, he looked at her once more. "You should fear what the town says," he murmured. Elsie's lips trembled into a faint, stubborn smile. "Let them talk." The storm groaned louder, shaking the rafters. Firelight flickered across his scarred chest, across her pale, determined face. Something unspoken swelled in the hush, not yet love but the beginning of something both fragile and fierce. And as the night deepened, the question lingered in the warmth between them, burning brighter than the fire, whether the path they had stepped upon together would save them, or ruin them both. The storm did not pass quickly. Days folded into one another, each wrapped in the hush of falling snow and the crackle of the small fire Elsie kept alive with relentless care. Her cabin, once a shelter for one, learned the weight of two, of his broad frame, his heavy chair, his silence that filled the room like another presence. At first, he tried to remain near the door, as though he were only a guest pausing briefly on a long road. But Elsie would not let him linger at the threshold. Each morning she pushed him closer to the fire, set food before him, laid wood where his hands could reach. It was not pity, though he often mistook it for that. It was her insistence that he belonged inside, not at the edges of life where the storm could claim him. He tested her resolve one dawn, when the snow lay heaviest against the window panes. She woke to find him struggling with the wheels, muscles taut, trying to force his way out the door. The cold rushed in like a predator, and she darted forward, her hands grasping the rims of his chair. "What are you doing?" she gasped, hair falling wild across her face. "I won't be a burden," he growled, jaw hard, sweat beading despite the chill. His strength was enough to move mountains, yet the chair stuck in the drift, refusing his escape. Elsie held on, heart pounding. "You'll kill yourself out there." His eyes burned at her, fierce with pride. "Better that than watching you wear yourself thin for me." Her breath shuddered, but she did not release the chair. Snow swirled around them, biting at her ankles, yet she stood fast. "Don't you see? I've been alone too long. You think you give me nothing, but you've kept me company. You've reminded me I am not invisible." His fury faltered. The wind whipped between them, tugging at his hair, but he stilled, staring at her as though he had never been seen before. Slowly, his grip loosened, and she guided him back inside. For the first time, he did not resist when she pulled a quilt across his legs. The days that followed softened in small ways. Dakota began to mend tools with the skill of hands still steady. He carved handles from wood, fixed the hinge on her door, sharpened the axe though he could not swing it. Elsie learned to set meals within his reach, not as charity but as partnership. They ate side by side, silence stretching long yet no longer empty. But outside their walls, whispers swelled like wolves circling. Martha Louder saw Elsie pushing him through town once, and her tongue wagged quick as a whip. "Trading your youth for a broken man," she sneered, loud enough for others to hear. Sheriff Amos shook his head, warning her she'd regret such foolishness. Children laughed, mimicking the creak of his wheels. Every errand Elsie made became a gauntlet of stares. One evening, after a trip to barter for flour, Elsie returned with her shoulders bowed under more than the weight of her sack. She set it down with trembling hands, and Dakota's eyes caught the glisten of tears she tried to hide. He wheeled closer, his chair groaning on the uneven floor. "What did they say?" he asked, though the answer was already carved in her silence. She lifted her chin, forcing steadiness into her voice. "Nothing I haven't heard before. That I'm desperate. That I'm wasting myself." His hands curled tight on the rims, the wood creaking. "They shame you because of me." She looked at him then, her gaze clear through the hurt. "They shame me because they cannot understand what they haven't felt. I will not live by their measure." For a moment the fire's light flickered across his face, and something shifted. His shame wavered, replaced by a fragile pride not in himself but in her. He bowed his head, not in defeat but in reverence. That night, as the storm roared outside, Elsie hummed softly while mending a shirt by firelight. Dakota watched, his scarred hands resting still upon his lap. The sound of her humming, cracked but steady, seeped into the spaces he had long believed hollow. He closed his eyes and let it fill him, a quiet music reminding him that life had not yet forsaken him entirely. As winter pressed harder, survival demanded more of them both. Elsie hauled water with raw red hands. She chopped kindling until blisters formed. Yet she smiled more often now, as if the weight she bore was no longer loneliness but purpose. Dakota, though bound to the chair, guided her with knowledge. How to set traps for rabbits, how to stretch broth with wild herbs. In his voice she heard a man who had once commanded respect, not the broken figure townsfolk mocked. One evening, after she returned with a rabbit snared from his teaching, she laid it before him proudly. "We'll eat well tonight," she said, cheeks flushed from cold. He looked at her, and something unspoken passed between them. Not gratitude, not yet love, but recognition, that together, they had built more than survival. They had begun to build a fragile home. Yet the world beyond their walls did not quiet. The louder Elsie's defiance grew, the sharper the town's judgment became. And Dakota knew each word of scorn was another stone laid upon her shoulders. Though her smile did not waver, he saw the way her hands sometimes trembled when she thought he wasn't looking. Late one night, he spoke into the dim glow of the fire. "You would be free of their scorn if I left." Elsie turned, the quilt slipping from her lap. Her voice carried the weight of all she had endured. "If you leave, the scorn remains. It always has. But if you stay, at least it means something." Her words struck deep, a truth he could not shake. For years he had believed dignity lay only in walking upright again, in reclaiming what had been lost. But here in this cabin with her, he began to wonder if dignity might also be found in being chosen, in being needed, in not surrendering to the cold silence of solitude. Snow pressed against the walls, heavy as judgment, yet inside the fire glowed steady. They sat in its warmth, two outcasts bound not by pity, but by the quiet, stubborn grace of survival shared. Still, beyond the cabin, voices sharpened, whispers cutting deeper with every passing day. And though they had carved out fragile peace, the storm of the world gathered, waiting to test whether what they had built could truly stand. Winter deepened until the snow stood shoulder-high against the cabins, and the sky itself seemed to sag with its own gray weight. Elsie's shawl grew thinner by the day, her hands red and cracked from labor, yet she still walked into town each week to barter. She carried what little she had, woven cloth, jars of broth stretched thin, snares from Dakota's teaching, and faced the gauntlet of stairs. The whispers did not quiet, they sharpened, slicing her with unseen blades. She returned home with her smile pinned in place, though Dakota saw the tremor in her fingers when she set her basket down. One evening, as firelight flickered against the low rafters, he caught her coughing, bent over the pot of broth. He wheeled forward, his shadow stretching across the floorboards. "Enough," he said, voice low but steady. "You give too much to keep me here." She straightened, pale but resolute. "And you give me reason. Don't you see, Dakota? Alone, I was only surviving. With you, I'm alive." Her words struck him like heat through frost, yet guilt clung still. For what dignity was left in a man who could not shield her from scorn? The trial came sooner than he expected. A storm had broken for one brief day, leaving the streets slushed with melting snow. Elsie walked into town with a basket of mended linens, Dakota watching from the cabin window as she vanished into the white horizon. Hours stretched. When at last she returned, her steps faltered, shoulders trembling. He wheeled forward quickly, meeting her at the door. Her eyes glistened, though no tears fell. "What happened?" he asked. Her lips quivered before the words left. "Silas Boone." Dakota's jaw set. Silas, the rancher with the cruel laugh, the man who had spat on his presence at the station. Elsie's voice broke as she recounted it. How Silas had cornered her near the mercantile, his breath heavy with whiskey, his words sharp as knives. "Leave the cripple," he had said. "Come with a man who can stand on his own feet. You're wasting yourself in that shack." She had pulled away, chin high, but the laughter had followed her down the street. Dakota wheeled back, fury surging hot. "I'll not let him shame you." "You can't," she began, but he was already gripping the rims, forcing his chair through the door. Snow met him like a wall, but his arms, thick as oak, drove him forward. The wheels carved tracks down the slope, across the drifts, into the heart of town. People turned as he rolled into the street, shirtless beneath his fur once more, snow clinging to the scars that marked his chest. The chair groaned under his weight, each push a thunderclap of defiance. Silence fell. Men paused at the saloon door, women stilled at their laundry lines. It was as though the very storm had hushed to watch. Silas Boone leaned against a post outside the mercantile, boots spread wide, a grin cutting his face. "Well now," he drawled, voice thick with mockery. "If it ain't the mighty Greyhawk, rolled in by his nurse." Laughter from a few men nearby echoed cruelly. Dakota wheeled closer, snow spitting from the rims. His voice carried low but strong. You measure a man by the legs beneath him. I measure him by the heart he carries. The words rippled through the street like a stone across still water. Silas sneered. Heart won't cut wood, won't plow fields, won't keep a woman warm. He stepped forward, hand curling into a fist. You shame her by keeping her. Before the blow could fall, Elsie stepped between them, her small figure lit by the pale sun. Her shawl whipped in the wind, her cheeks flushed, but her voice rang out clear. The only shame here is yours, Silas Boone. A murmur rose from the crowd. Martha Louder gasped, scandal sharp on her tongue, but Sheriff Amos's eyes narrowed with something softer, surprise, perhaps even respect. Silas laughed, though it faltered at the edges. You defend him? I stand with him, she said simply. Her words cut sharper than any blade. Silas's fist hovered in the air, but in the silence that followed, the weight of every watching eye bore down. To strike now would not only shame Dakota but himself. He lowered his hand slowly, muttering curses as he backed away into the saloon's shadow. For a long breath, no one moved. Then Dakota lifted his chin, meeting the gazes of those who had mocked him. Snow glistened on his scars, fire burned in his eyes, and in his stillness there was more strength than any could deny. The whispers faltered. Even the cruelest tongues did not dare rise. Elsie's hand touched his shoulder, light as snow. For the first time, she saw no shame in his face, only dignity reclaimed. Together they turned, the wheels carving fresh tracks through the slush as the crowd parted silently. Back at the cabin, Elsie lit the fire with trembling hands, and Dakota watched the flame grow. His chest rose, heavy with breath, as though the act of defiance had restored not only his pride but something deeper, a place in the world he thought lost. Yet even as warmth filled the small room, a shadow lingered in his mind. They will not forgive us, he said quietly. Elsie looked at him across the glow, her voice steady though her eyes glistened. Then we will not ask forgiveness. Outside, the wind gathered once more, rattling shutters, piling snow against the door. Inside, silence stretched between them, but it was not the silence of shame, it was the silence before a storm greater still. And in that hush, Dakota knew. The trial had only begun. Snow lay heavy across the land, muffling every sound as though the world itself held its breath. The cabin roof sagged under its burden, the windows frosted white, the hearth within burning low. Elsie lay in bed, her skin pale with fever, breath shallow, lips trembling with each exhale. Weeks of labor and judgment had worn her thin, and the sickness had seized her like a storm at sea. Dakota kept vigil. His broad frame bent close, scarred hands steady as he pressed a damp cloth to her brow. He had carried her. Yes, carried her, though his legs were dead, lifting her in his arms from chair to bed when she had collapsed. He had not left her side since. His heart, once locked behind walls of shame, broke with every shallow breath she drew. The man who had thought himself a burden, now found life unthinkable without her. He whispered her name into the silence. Elsie. His voice cracked like ice breaking under weight. She stirred faintly, lashes fluttering, but did not wake. The days blurred into one another. He fed the fire with trembling hands, fetched water with arms that ached from dragging buckets across the floor. He prayed in the language of his ancestors, in low tones that filled the room with something larger than grief. He told her stories she could not hear, of the rivers of his childhood, of horses that thundered across endless plains. And in the stillness between, he feared. At last, as dawn bled pale across the snow, her fever broke. Elsie's eyes opened, clouded but alive. She saw him slump beside her, head bowed, and her hand crept from beneath the quilt to touch his face. He startled awake, and in that moment, relief flooded him like spring thawing a frozen river. Tears burned unashamed on his cheeks. I thought I'd lost you, he whispered. Her smile was faint but steady. You never will. It was then he knew what must be done. No more hiding at the edges of town, no more bearing scorn as though it were their fate. They would claim what the world had denied them. Dignity, belonging, and a bond no whisper could undo. The snow had not relented, yet he wheeled her into town days later, wrapped in quilts, her hand resting on his shoulder. The streets hushed as they passed. Doors opened. Faces pressed to glass. Gossip followed them like a shadow, but so too did awe. For here was the giant once mocked, scarred and bound to wheels, carrying not shame but a woman who looked at him as though he were the last safe place in the world. At the chapel, the bell tolled. Sheriff Amos stood waiting, hat in hand, his face caught between doubt and something gentler. Martha Louder whispered furiously in the pews, her eyes alight with scandal. Silas Boone lingered near the door, arms crossed, ready to sneer. But Elsie and Dakota did not falter. They moved to the altar together, the firelight of candles casting long shadows behind them. The preacher cleared his throat, words trembling as though the weight of judgment pressed even on him. Do you take? Before he could finish, Silas's voice cut sharp through the hush. This is a mockery. A cripple in a chair, an outcast squawking of vows. It ain't fit, and you know it. The crowd gasped, scandal rippling like fire through dry grass. But Elsie rose from the chair, fragile though she was, and turned to face Silas. Her voice rang out, clear as a bell. The only mockery is the cruelty of men who think worth is measured by legs and not by the soul. The room stilled. Silas's mouth opened, but no words came. His fists clenched, yet he did not step forward. Sheriff Amos shifted, his hand hovering at his holster, his gaze firm. For the first time, authority stood not with Silas, but against him. Dakota reached for Elsie's hand. She placed it in his, her small fingers strong despite her weakness. Their eyes met, and in that gaze the hush deepened. Not silence of scorn but silence of reverence. The preacher, voice shaking less now, continued. Do you, Elsie Bell McGraw, take this man? I do, she said without hesitation. And do you, Dakota Greyhawk? I do, he said, his voice like thunder carried across snow. The words sealed not just a vow but a defiance, a claim to life beyond shame. The preacher declared them bound, and in that moment, something broke in the crowd. The murmurs shifted. Not gossip now but awe, some even admiration. For they had seen two outcasts lift one another from the cold and name it love. Snow swirled outside as though blessing fell from the sky. Within the chapel, Elsie leaned into him, resting her head against his chest, and Dakota's arms folded her close. For the first time, the scars across his body bore no weight of disgrace. They were proof of survival, proof that he had endured long enough to find her. Yet even as the vows ended, Dakota's eyes flicked to Silas Boone, whose scowl had not softened. In that shadow he saw the shape of battles yet to come. They had won dignity this day, but the world beyond still bristled with judgment. Still, when Elsie whispered, "We are not alone anymore," the storm inside him quieted. The words were promise enough to carry him forward. The chapel doors burst open, wind rushing in, scattering snow across the aisle. The candles flickered, light bending toward shadow, and for a heartbeat the whole town seemed caught between what had been and what might yet come. Dakota held Elsie's hand tighter, his chest rising steady against hers, and in the glow of firelight and storm, it was clear their story had only just begun.